Welcome to Transmission Podcast. I'm your host, Cecilia Lynn Jacobs. We are currently hard at work preparing for the full mixed reality premiere of Transmission at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. As we enter into our final rehearsals and show preparations, we're sitting down with the show's creative team to talk about the many facets of this work and how it's all coming together. On this episode, we speak with the show's writers about their experiences bringing Transmission to life. Please, stay close. Before we launch into this, I've talked to Maggie and Justine kind of on the fly about what's important to capture and talk about here. But let me know if you guys have thoughts. Let's get some names and who you are and what you do and your relatedness in life.
I'm Justine Garrett. I'm one of the writers of Transmission. I am a writer. I also work at the University of Toronto in the Office of the Provost, and I do improv comedy. And I have two kids, Miles and Henrietta, with Ian Garrett, one of the other writers of Transmission.
Just for the record, they're both here fabulously and both under 3. So the background noise that you hear is them. And Ian, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Ian Garrett, father of Miles Garrett. I'm Ian Garrett, and I'm one of the writers and producer and father to Miles and Henrietta. Henrietta, who is in my lap, going to town on a pacifier.
Fabulous. And Ian, what do you do when you are not doing fatherly related things and transmission related things?
When I am not working on Transmission or being or dadding, I'm a designer and producer for theater primarily, and I'm a professor at York University. Teach theater design and focus on issues of sustainability in my research.
Excellent. Maggie?
I'm Maggie Sulc. I am a writer and dramaturge on Transmission. I'm currently, when I'm not doing Transmission, I'm also a playwright and screenwriter. And all the rest of my time is spent working in textbook publishing and sales.
So how did you guys end up knowing each other and hanging around together? I know Ian and Justine, this is a longer story, but how did you become, the three of you become Team Transmission?
So Justine and I have a longer backstory that predates Transmission. There's a number of different ideas that were floating together for the project for a few years, and then there were a number of ideas floating around for the project, and it was used as the umbrella project for the Indy Convergence, which is it used to be pop-up, now has a permanent home, residency in Indianapolis that I've been involved with since it started in 2008. So the way that residency works is that there are about a dozen or a dozen and a half artists that come in. They all come in with side projects, and then there's one overarching umbrella project that takes people through that residency, and actually one that happened previously in Toronto. And both Maggie and Justine were there for a lot of that. Justine and I have been talking about the show for a long time as it's been developed. And then Maggie, who I know because she was also a grad student at York a few years ago, got involved in the rapid creation of content in that setting, and has been with us since.
I particularly remember coming on the project in like October or November of 2014. So I just finished grad school and working as Ian's grad assistant. He was actually part of the reason I picked going to York in the first place. So I was like, everybody asked, why are you going to Toronto for grad school when you're from Texas? I was like, wait, but there's other graduates from my theater program in Toronto. Anyways, I just finished my graduate degree, and Ian said, are you interested in working on this project? We're really interested in haunted spaces and this huge idea of science fiction being a mirror to what's going on right now. And I 100% was like, yes, I want it. And so, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, you finish.
Okay. I went with Ian in August 2014 to the Edinburgh Fringe, and Miles was born in June of that year. I flew alone to meet them, and I remember getting off the plane and walking to our flat, and Ian telling me in my sleep-deprived overnight red-eye haze about this idea of haunting spaces around Edinburgh. And during that trip, we started to talk a little bit about it, about looking at different places and spaces. And when we went the next year, the idea solidified in my mind a little bit more in earnest. And then that following, well, before that, in June of 2015, working at Indy Convergence altogether is the first time that I really worked with you directly on the project, Maggie.
At the Indy Convergence in 2015 was the first time that Justine and Ian and I were all really working on it in the sim space together. And that's where we came up with a lot of the logistics of how the location worked and getting new people involved and seeing that. But also for the final workshop, we figured out a lot of what the conflict would be and how characters could really work with the narrative to drive the story.
Yeah, the relationships of one sibling that goes and one that stays. I think it was originally like a brother and a sister. And then, yeah.
But we figured out that, like, yeah, the family dynamics were important relationships to work off of.
Yeah.
And some of the religious elements, because part of where we were working at the Indy Convergence was a deconsecrated church, where we were doing some of the performances. So we took advantage of that location to film some initial scenes.
So it sounds like Indy Convergence is something that really solidified the process. And you guys as a creative team, does that sound about right if I describe it like that?
Yeah, it gave us the opportunity. We did essentially 2-week workshops that were organized through the Indy Convergence. One in Toronto, where we mainly looked at storytelling as related to locations, specifically moving people around locations, which we didn't really necessarily have a story, but a concept of what would be happening. And then a lot of the not necessarily the story elements, but not necessarily like the actual story that we end up with, but the priorities of what the story needed to do and various elements were developed in Indianapolis, and how we thought that they would interconnect with each other to be a little bit more cohesive came out of that 2 weeks.
So it sounds like while you guys kind of got together and solidified your working relationships, figured out a couple of key elements about what you were doing and what was important, it sounds like there was a lot of kind of creative thinking that maybe happened more on all three of your guys' part, more on Ian's part. But I do want to hear about the kind of like internal fomenting of this. Like, where is this coming from, and how long was that kind of bubbling around before it ended up making an appearance in the real world with multiple people, right? There's usually quite a bit of underground stuff that happens.
Yeah, so I can back up the history.
Yeah,
pretty far. So every time I've like backed up the history of the development of the show, it's gotten farther. I think that the farthest back that I can actually identify something that is now part of transmission is actually in middle school. we were I was assigned a project where you were supposed to read multiple stories of an author. And I wanted to. I chose Anthony Burgess, who wrote Clockwork Orange, and was interested in reading other books of his. And one of the ones that I found because it was in the library was called "The End of the World News," which was this. It's a frame story, or it's a story that's framed by a prologue and epilogue that take place in the future. On a generational ship, and the actual story itself, the intervening are three unrelated stories. One is about essentially this asteroid that's going to come and destroy the planet, and preparing for that generational ship. And a family, actually, dynamics in there. One is a musical about Trotsky in New York. And the last one is about Freud leaving Vienna during World War II. And it was talking about, like, the human history and what's to be believed as archive. So there was this idea that had been sticking with me for a while, and through grad school I sort of used it as a touchstone to talk about how to dramatize something of that nature. So there's a little bit of the idea there. In 2010, at the Dance USA conference in Chicago, I was talking to the Cassie Miedor from the Dance Exchange, who was starting on this project called 500 Miles, 500 Stories, where they were going to be walking from between their studio outside of DC, either to or from the coal mines where the coal that would go to generate the electricity to power their studio was mined, and creating content along the way.
And just for clarification, what is the Dance Exchange again?
So the Dance Exchange, formerly the Liz Lerman Dance Exchange, is sort of a storied dance company based just outside of DC, or they're DC based, and they do a lot of community engaged work, and especially with their current artistic director. After Liz left and it became just the Dance Exchange, Cassie is very invested also in environmental and environmental justice issues. So the Dance Exchange was doing this work that was looking at engaging with the community between these 2 points, but sometimes they'd also be creating work out in the wilderness, or not without anybody except for the company traveling with them. And we had a conversation before they had engaged with this about how do you archive this. And there was this thought of, well, it being dance, if you were to, what if you were to embed video like a historical marker through some sort of essentially augmented reality. I don't think we called it that in the conversation, but some sort of process where you would essentially be able to play back the video in the space where it happened, so you get that connection to place there. And that's sort of where the idea of The Haunting was born. And fast forwarding a couple of years, this idea of the haunting, the haunting aspect of using technology was part of it. This idea of a story about interstellar travel over a generational period that was a result of a passive confirmation of aliens, that we just sort of got their leakage. Hi, baby. And then I was in Edinburgh. I've been going to Edinburgh consistently since 2008, and I was walking around, and there are so many places that you can go in Edinburgh where there's hidden alleyways and closes that you can go in, that especially during the festival time you wouldn't be shocked if something interesting was happening in there, and as one of the historically recorded or supposed most haunted sites in Europe, because of its sort of medieval history and the city upon city aspect, that it would also make sense to bring technology into creating an actual haunted environment. So it all sort of coalesced in, I guess, 2014, and sort of committed to okay, let's make this thing.
This idea of haunted video and haunted audio, that is
something that has developed for you guys, obviously, out of creating this project. But